Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. Sometimes the family that raised you becomes the family that uses you. And sometimes standing up for yourself feels like the scariest thing in the world until you realize that staying silent is slowly killing the person you were meant to become. This is the story of Emma, a 24-year-old woman from a small town in Indiana who thought she was doing the right thing by putting her family first. But what started as temporary help turned into a prison of expectations, guilt, and endless demands that nearly cost her everything she'd worked so hard to achieve. If you've ever felt like the giver in your family, the one everyone turns to but no one thinks to protect, this story might feel painfully familiar. Emma had always been the responsible one, the daughter who colored inside the lines, who did her homework without being asked, who never caused drama or made waves. While her older sister Madison was out winning homecoming queen and dating the quarterback, Emma was in her room studying, dreaming of the day she would graduate from high school, go to college, and finally start her own life. She had it all planned out, step by careful step. Graduate with honors, attend Indiana State University for her accounting degree, land a good job at a respectable company, and move to Indianapolis where she could finally be independent and free. For 4 years, this dream sustained her through late nights of studying, through watching Madison get all the attention and praise, through being the overlooked middle child who was reliable but never celebrated. Emma told herself that her time would come, that all the hard work and sacrifice would pay off when she finally had her own apartment, her own life, her own choices to make without anyone else's opinion or needs weighing her down. But life, as Emma would learn, rarely follows the neat little plans we make for ourselves. When she graduated summa cum laude with her accounting degree and returned home to Bloomington, Indiana, she thought it would be temporary. Just a few months to save money, find a job, and get on her feet before making the big move to the city. Her parents, Linda and Frank, welcomed her back with open arms and promises that she could take all the time she needed. They seemed genuinely proud of her achievement, and for a moment, Emma felt like maybe she was finally being seen, finally being valued for who she was, rather than just what she could do for others. The plan was simple and reasonable. No rent while she job hunted, home-cooked meals, and a chance to reconnect with her family before starting her adult life. Emma told herself it was a smart financial decision, a way to start her career without the burden of student loan debt and living expenses draining her savings before she even began. But what felt like a practical choice in those first few weeks would slowly transform into something entirely different. Something that would test every boundary she thought she had and every belief she held about what family was supposed to mean. Within 2 weeks of being home, Emma landed a position as a junior financial analyst at Henderson Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm that specialized in small business consulting. The salary wasn't spectacular, but it was steady, and the benefits were decent enough for someone just starting their career. She felt a surge of pride and relief as she accepted the offer, thinking that this was the first real step toward her independence. She came home that evening practically glowing with excitement, ready to share the news with her parents and start planning her next moves. But the celebration she had imagined never materialized. Instead of congratulations and excitement about her future, her parents exchanged one of those loaded glances that she had learned to recognize and dread throughout her childhood. It was the look that meant they had already discussed something about her, something they had decided without her input, something that was going to change everything she thought she knew about her situation. Her mother, Linda, set down her coffee cup with that particular carefulness that meant she was about to deliver news that Emma wouldn't want to hear. The smile on her face was too tight, too practiced, and Emma's stomach immediately began to knot with anxiety. She knew that look, had seen it countless times before when her parents were about to ask her to give up something she wanted for the good of the family, for the greater good, for reasons that always seemed to make sense for everyone except her. Linda's voice was gentle but firm as she explained that things had gotten more difficult since Emma had been away at college. Frank's hours at the automotive plant had been cut back significantly, and there were rumors of more layoffs coming. Her own part-time job at the local library wasn't bringing in nearly enough to cover the gap, especially with her arthritis making it harder to work the longer shifts they needed her to take. The house payment, the utilities, the insurance, the everyday expenses of keeping a family afloat had become overwhelming for two people who were supposed to be thinking about retirement, not struggling to make ends meet. Emma sat there listening to the financial breakdown of her childhood home, feeling the weight of expectations settling on her shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome coat. She could see where this conversation was heading, could feel the trap closing around her before the words were even spoken. But she also saw the genuine worry in her mother's eyes, the way her father's shoulders sagged with the weight of being unable to provide for his family the way he always had. These were the people who had raised her, who had sacrificed for her education, who had always been there when she needed them. How could she possibly say no when they needed her? The request, when it finally came, seemed reasonable enough on the surface. Just help with some of the household expenses just until things stabilized economically. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would prevent her from saving money and working toward her goals. Just a contribution toward utilities, groceries, maybe help with some of the unexpected expenses that always seem to pop up when you were trying to make ends meet. Emma found herself nodding, agreeing, telling her parents that of course she would help, that it was the least she could do after everything they had done for her. But even as the words left her mouth, Emma felt a chill of premonition, a sense that she was agreeing to something much bigger than what was being discussed. She pushed the feeling away, telling herself that she was being paranoid, that this was just a temporary situation that would resolve itself once her parents got back on their feet. She was family, and family helped each other. It was as simple as that, or at least that's what she told herself as she watched relief flood her parents' faces. Over the next several months, Emma settled into a routine that felt sustainable, if not exactly what she had planned. She would wake up early, drive to her job in the city, spend her days analyzing spreadsheets and helping small business owners make sense of their finances, then come home to the familiar comfort of her childhood bedroom. Every month, she dutifully handed over a significant portion of her paycheck to help cover the household expenses. And every month, she told herself that next month, she would start seriously saving for her own place. But as time went on, the requests for help began to expand beyond just financial contributions. When her mother's arthritis flared up, Emma found herself running errands, grocery shopping, and handling tasks that Linda simply couldn't manage on particularly difficult days. When her father struggled with the computerized systems at work, Emma spent her evenings helping him navigate online training modules and digital timesheets that seemed designed to frustrate anyone over the age of 50. These additional responsibilities felt natural, even good, at first. Emma told herself that this was what being an adult meant, that contributing to her family's well-being was a sign of maturity and love. But she also began to notice that every time she mentioned saving money for her own apartment, every time she brought up her plans to move to Indianapolis, her parents' responses became increasingly strained. There were subtle comments about how expensive it was to live alone, how dangerous the city could be for a young woman, how much they would miss having her around. More concerning were the guilt-laden observations about how much easier their lives had become with her help, how they didn't know what they would do if she left them to struggle on their own. These comments weren't delivered as manipulation, but rather as simple statements of fact, observations about the reality that nonetheless made Emma feel selfish and ungrateful every time she thought about her own needs and desires. When Emma tried to discuss her future plans, the conversation somehow always became about her parents' immediate needs. When she mentioned wanting to save money faster by perhaps getting a second job, her mother's response was to worry aloud about whether Emma would still have time to help with the things they needed. When she talked about looking at apartments, her father would shake his head sadly and make comments about young people who abandoned their families the moment things got convenient. The word abandonment stung particularly deeply because Emma knew in her heart that she wasn't abandoning anyone. She was trying to build a life, trying to become the independent adult that she had worked so hard to become. But somehow, in the dynamic that had developed in their household, her desire for independence was being framed as selfishness, her dreams as betrayal, her normal developmental needs as ingratitude. As the months stretched on, Emma began to feel increasingly trapped in a situation that she had thought would be temporary, but that seemed to have no clear end date. Her savings account remained frustratingly stagnant, her dreams of city life growing hazier with each passing month. She watched friends from college move to exciting cities, start careers, begin relationships, and explore the world while she felt frozen in time, caught between childhood and adulthood in a way that served everyone's needs except her own. The guilt was constant and exhausting. Every dollar she spent on herself felt like money stolen from her family's stability. Every evening out with friends felt like time stolen from people who needed her. Every dream she entertained about her own future felt like a betrayal of the people who had given her everything. Emma found herself apologizing for things that shouldn't have required apologies, asking permission for decisions that should have been entirely her own, and constantly second-guessing her own needs and desires. But just when Emma thought she had found some kind of equilibrium in this complicated family dynamic, just when she had convinced herself that maybe this was what adult responsibility looked like, Her older sister Madison arrived on their doorstep with a crisis that would upend everything Emma thought she understood about family, fairness, and her own value in the people she loved most. It was a humid Thursday evening in late June when the doorbell rang with an urgency that immediately set Emma's nerves on edge. She opened the front door to find Madison standing on the porch, her face streaked with tears and her usual perfect composure completely shattered. Behind her stood her husband Derek, looking exhausted and defeated as he struggled to manage their two young children, Harper, who was 7, and Mason, who was 5, both of whom seemed to be feeding off their parents' stress and bouncing around with manic energy. Madison didn't wait for an invitation or explanation before pushing past Emma into the living room, where she collapsed onto the couch with a dramatic sob that brought their parents running from different corners of the house. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, watching as Derek dragged suitcases and bags from their car, his movements heavy with the weight of whatever crisis had brought them here without warning or invitation. The story that Madison tearfully delivered to their assembled family was one of sudden financial catastrophe and professional disappointment. Derek's position as a marketing consultant for a regional firm had been eliminated in a round of budget cuts, and Madison's boutique clothing store, which had been struggling for months, had finally been forced to close when their biggest supplier demanded immediate payment for outstanding invoices. In the span of 2 weeks, they had gone from a comfortable dual-income family to unemployed parents facing eviction from their rental house. Emma listened to Madison's dramatic recounting of their misfortunes with a mixture of sympathy and growing unease. While she genuinely felt sorry for her sister's situation, she couldn't help but notice that Madison seemed to be presenting their crisis as something that had happened to them rather than something they might have had any role in creating. There was no mention of the expensive vacations they had taken throughout the year, no acknowledgement of the designer clothes and luxury purchases that Emma had seen documented all over Madison's social media accounts. What disturbed Emma even more was the immediate and unquestioning way their parents responded to Madison's crisis. Within minutes, Linda was bustling around making up beds and clearing space in closets, while Frank was already talking about moving his workshop out of the spare room to create more living space. The assumption seemed to be that, of course, Madison and her family would stay as long as they needed, that, of course, the family would rally around them, that, of course, everyone would sacrifice to help them get back on their feet. Emma found herself wondering where this automatic generosity and understanding had been when she had needed help, when she had been struggling to find her footing after college, when she had been trying to balance her own needs with her family's expectations. But she pushed these thoughts away, telling herself that she was being selfish and petty. Madison's situation was genuinely dire, involving not just her own welfare but that of 2 innocent children who had no control over their circumstances. Over the next few days, Emma watched as her already complicated living situation became exponentially more challenging. The house that had felt cramped with 3 adults suddenly felt chaotic with 7 people, including 2 energetic children who had no understanding of boundaries or quiet time. Harper and Mason treated the house like their personal playground, running through rooms, leaving toys and snacks everywhere, and turning every meal into a complex negotiation about what they would and wouldn't eat. But what bothered Emma most wasn't the noise or the mess or even the crowded conditions. It was the immediate and natural way that she seemed to become the default caretaker for Harper and Mason whenever Madison and Derek needed time to handle their job search, their financial planning, or simply their own stress relief. There was never a formal conversation about childcare responsibilities, never an actual request for Emma to babysit or help with the children. Instead, there were casual comments about running errands that would be easier without the kids, suggestions that perhaps Emma could keep an eye on Harper and Mason while the adults talked about serious matters, assumptions that, of course, Emma wouldn't mind helping out with family. The first few times, Emma genuinely didn't mind. She enjoyed spending time with her nephew and niece, and she understood that Madison and Derek were under enormous stress as they tried to rebuild their lives from what felt like complete collapse. But as the days turned into weeks, Emma began to realize that what had started as occasional help was becoming a regular expectation, a assumed responsibility that no one had actually discussed with her. Madison had a way of asking for help that made it impossible to refuse without seeming heartless or selfish. She would sigh dramatically while looking at job listings online and mention how impossible it was to focus on applications with children demanding attention every 5 minutes. She would make comments about how Derek couldn't possibly network effectively or attend interviews with Harper and Mason in tow. She would express gratitude for Emma's help in ways that made it clear that refusing future help would be not just disappointing but actually harmful to the family's recovery. The guilt was expertly applied and devastatingly effective. How could Emma prioritize her own comfort over her sister's desperate need to find employment and housing? How could she complain about babysitting when Madison was facing the possibility of homelessness? How could she focus on her own relatively minor inconveniences when two innocent children needed stability and care during one of the most traumatic periods of their young lives? But as the weeks turned into months, Emma began to feel like she was drowning in responsibilities that she had never actually agreed to take on. Her own life, which had already been complicated by her parents' financial needs, became completely subordinated to the crisis management that seemed to consume every aspect of their household. She found herself rushing home from work not to relax or pursue her own interests, but to take over childcare duties so that Madison and Derek could attend networking events, job interviews, or simply have adult time to decompress from their stress. Weekends became especially difficult because Madison and Derek seemed to view them as opportunities for extended breaks from parenting rather than family time. Emma would wake up on Saturday mornings hoping for rest and personal time, only to discover that Madison and Derek had made plans to meet friends for brunch or attend job fair networking events that would last most of the day. The expectation was that Emma would naturally step in to provide childcare, entertainment, and supervision for Harper and Mason without any acknowledgement that she might have wanted to make her own plans. When Emma tried to push back gently, suggesting that perhaps she could help with the children for a few hours but needed some advance notice to plan accordingly, Madison's response was to act hurt and confused about why Emma was being so difficult. These conversations always seemed to happen in front of their parents, who would inevitably side with Madison's perspective that family should help family unconditionally, that Emma was being selfish to prioritize her own convenience over the family's needs during such a difficult time. The financial pressure also intensified dramatically with 4 additional people living in the house. The grocery bills doubled, the utility costs skyrocketed, and there seemed to be constant unexpected expenses related to Harper and Mason's needs for school supplies, clothing, and activities. Emma found herself contributing even more of her paycheck to household expenses while watching her savings account remain completely stagnant. Every month, she told herself that next month would be different, that Madison and Derek would find jobs and move out, that she would finally be able to start building toward her own future again. But Madison and Derek seemed to be settling into a comfortable routine that showed no signs of temporary status. They arranged their belongings in the spare room as if they were planning to stay indefinitely, established routines and expectations that assumed Emma's continued availability and support, and made comments about how nice it was to have family help during such a challenging time. There was never any discussion of timelines for moving out, never any concrete plans for when they might be able to resume independent living, never any acknowledgement that their presence was significantly impacting Emma's own life and plans. Emma began to feel invisible in her own family, valued only for what she could provide rather than who she was as a person. Her contributions to the household were taken for granted, her help with the children was expected rather than appreciated, and her own needs and goals were consistently treated as less important than everyone else's immediate concerns. She was the stable one, the reliable one, the one who could always be counted on to sacrifice her own interests for the good of the family. The breaking point came, as these things often do, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a casual conversation that revealed just how little her own agency mattered to the people she loved most. Emma was sitting in her room one evening, trying to focus on a professional development course she was taking online when she overheard her mother talking on the phone with someone about weekend plans. The conversation was cheerful and excited, full of anticipation about a family gathering that sounded wonderful and fun. Linda was discussing logistics for a trip to celebrate Great Aunt Caroline's retirement party in Florida, a big family gathering that would include extended relatives Emma hadn't seen in years. The conversation was full of details about flight arrangements, hotel reservations, and planning for what sounded like a lavish celebration that would span an entire weekend. Emma found herself smiling as she listened, thinking about how nice it would be to see family members she had missed and to have a real vacation. Something fun and relaxing that didn't involve managing anyone else's crisis or needs. But as the conversation continued, Emma's smile faded as she began to understand that she was not included in these plans. Linda was talking about arrangements for Madison, Derek, Linda, and Frank, discussing how wonderful it would be to have the whole family together for such a special occasion. There was no mention of Emma's participation, no discussion of her schedule or preferences, no consideration of her presence at all. Instead, Emma heard her mother casually mention that, of course, Emma would stay home with Harper and Mason, That it just made sense for someone to watch the children since a retirement party wouldn't be appropriate or enjoyable for kids that age. The assumption was so natural, so unquestioned, that Linda didn't even seem to consider that this arrangement might be something that should be discussed with Emma rather than simply decided for her. Emma felt a cold shock of recognition as she realized that once again, her life was being planned around everyone else's needs without anyone thinking to ask what she might want or need. She was not seen as a family member who might enjoy a vacation or want to celebrate with relatives. She was seen as the built-in childcare solution, the person whose role it was to stay behind and manage the responsibilities that would interfere with everyone else's good time. The hurt was immediate and overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by a rising anger that surprised Emma with its intensity. She had been patient and accommodating and selfless for months, contributing financially to the household, providing childcare for her sister's children, putting her own life on hold to help her family through their various crises. And her reward for all of this sacrifice was to be automatically excluded from family celebrations, to be taken for granted as the person who would handle the inconvenient parts of family life while everyone else enjoyed the fun parts. Emma spent the next several days listening to excited conversations about the Florida trip, watching her family make plans for restaurants and activities and quality time together, all while the assumption that she would provide free childcare remained unspoken but absolute. No one asked her if she wanted to come. No one asked if she minded staying with the children. No one seemed to consider that she might have opinions or feelings about being left behind while everyone else enjoyed a luxury vacation that cost more than she made in several months. The injustice of it all felt overwhelming, but what hurt even more was the realization that her family genuinely didn't seem to understand that they were treating her unfairly. In their minds, Emma was the responsible one, the one who could be counted on, the one whose role it was to hold everything together while everyone else pursued their own happiness and fulfillment. They probably thought they were complimenting her reliability and trustworthiness by automatically assuming she would handle whatever needed to be handled. But Emma was beginning to understand that being seen as reliable and responsible was just another way of being taken for granted, that her willingness to help had become an expectation that left no room for her own needs or desires. She was valued for her usefulness rather than her personhood, appreciated for her contributions rather than her presence, needed for her function rather than her fellowship. As the departure date for the Florida trip approached, Emma found herself facing a choice that felt both terrifying and necessary. She could continue being the person everyone expected her to be, staying home and caring for Harper and Mason while her family enjoyed their vacation without her. She could accept her role as the family member who sacrificed so that others could thrive, who stayed behind so that others could move forward, who gave up her own dreams so that others could pursue theirs. Or she could finally, for the first time in her life, put herself first. She could make a choice based on her own needs rather than everyone else's expectations. She could refuse to be taken for granted any longer, even if it meant disappointing people who had come to depend on her constant availability and sacrifice. The decision, when Emma finally made it, felt both revolutionary and terrifying. She was going to leave. She was going to make her own plans for that weekend, plans that had nothing to do with managing anyone else's responsibilities or needs. She was going to discover what it felt like to be selfish, to prioritize her own happiness, to say no to people who had never learned to hear that word from her. Emma remembered that her college friend Jessica had mentioned going on a hiking trip that same weekend to Brown County State Park, a camping adventure with some of their mutual friends that had sounded fun but impossible given Emma's family responsibilities. She pulled out her phone and sent Jessica a text asking if there was still space for one more person on the trip. The response came back almost immediately with enthusiasm and excitement about Emma finally being able to join one of their adventures. Making that commitment felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. Emma had never simply disappeared from her family's expectations without explanation or permission. She had never put her own desires ahead of her family's needs. She had never refused to be available when they needed her to be available. But as scary as it also felt necessary. Like something she had to do to save herself from disappearing entirely into other people's lives and needs. The days leading up to the weekend were tense with unspoken expectations and assumptions. Madison was busy shopping for vacation clothes and talking excitedly about beach time and family dinners at expensive restaurants. Derek seemed more relaxed than he had been in months, already mentally on vacation from the stress of job hunting and financial worry. Linda and Frank were making lists and checking arrangements and generally behaving like grandparents excited about quality time with family. Meanwhile, Emma was quietly making her own preparations, packing hiking clothes and camping gear, planning for a weekend of outdoor adventure and friendship and personal freedom. She told no one about her plans, knowing instinctively that any advance warning would result in guilt trips and manipulation designed to make her change her mind. She would simply leave, the way her family had simply decided she would stay, and let them figure out how to handle the consequences of their assumptions. Friday morning, Emma's family left for the airport in a flurry of excitement and last-minute packing, calling out casual reminders about Harper and Mason's bedtime routines and meal preferences as they headed out the door. There were no expressions of gratitude for Emma's assumed sacrifice, no acknowledgments of what she was giving up to provide their childcare, no recognition that she might have preferred to be part of the family vacation rather than the person left behind to manage the inconvenient parts. Emma watched them drive away and felt a mixture of sadness and liberation that surprised her with its intensity. She was sad that her family took her for granted so completely that they couldn't even see her as a person who might want to be included in family celebrations. But she was also excited about the prospect of finally doing something purely for herself, of discovering what it felt like to make choices based on her own desires rather than everyone else's needs and expectations. 5 o'clock Saturday morning, Emma loaded her camping gear into her car and drove away from her childhood home toward Babysitting, toward Brown County State Park, and a weekend of freedom that would change everything about how she understood herself and her relationship with her family. For the first time in months, she was making a choice that was entirely her own, pursuing an experience that was about her happiness rather than her usefulness, investing in relationships that valued her presence rather than her service. The camping trip was everything Emma had forgotten she needed, a reminder of who she was beneath all the roles and responsibilities and expectations that had consumed her identity for so many months. She hiked through beautiful forests, sat around campfires sharing stories and laughter with friends who saw her as a person rather than a solution to their problems, slept under stars in a tent that belonged only to her, and woke up refreshed and peaceful in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. For 3 days, Emma's phone stayed in her backpack, turned off and ignored as she focused on being present in her own life rather than constantly available for everyone else's emergencies and needs. She didn't check in with her family, didn't worry about Harper and Mason, didn't feel guilty about prioritizing her own well-being and happiness. For the first time in months, she was simply Emma, not Emma the helpful daughter, Emma the reliable sister, Emma the convenient babysitter, Emma the financial contributor, but just Emma the person with her own interests and friendships and right to pursue her own fulfillment. When she finally turned her phone back on during the drive home Sunday evening, Emma was amazed to discover 17 missed calls and dozens of text messages, all increasingly frantic and angry as her family realized that their assumptions about her availability had been incorrect. The messages started with confusion about where she was, progressed through annoyance about her failure to communicate, and eventually escalated to genuine panic about the children's welfare and threats about calling authorities if she didn't respond immediately. Emma felt her peaceful weekend calm evaporate as she scrolled through the increasingly hysterical messages from her mother, the angry demands from Madison, and the worried texts from Derek asking where she was and whether she was safe. It was clear that her absence had created significant chaos and that her family was furious about being forced to deal with the consequences of their own assumptions and poor planning. By the time Emma pulled into her driveway, she could see lights on throughout the house and movement behind the windows that suggested her family had returned early from their vacation to deal with the crisis of her unavailability. She sat in her car for several minutes, gathering her courage for the confrontation that awaited her, knowing that her choice to prioritize herself was about to be met with anger, guilt, and accusations that would test every boundary she was trying to establish. The explosion of fury that greeted Emma as she walked through the front door was unlike anything she had ever experienced from her family. Madison was standing in the living room with her arms crossed, her face flushed with rage and indignation, while Derek sat on the couch looking exhausted and defeated. Linda was pacing back and forth with the manic energy of someone who had been worrying and panicking for days, while Frank stood in the doorway looking disappointed and confused about what had gone so wrong. The accusations came fast and furious, overlapping and building on each other until Emma felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of anger and blame being directed at her. Madison was furious about having to cut short their vacation and return home to deal with childcare responsibilities they had assumed would be handled. Linda was hurt and confused about Emma's failure to communicate or explain her absence. Derek was concerned about the children's welfare and the trauma of being left with grandparents who hadn't been prepared to handle full-time childcare for an entire weekend. But underneath all the specific complaints and accusations, Emma could hear the deeper message that her family was communicating, which was that her choice to prioritize herself had been selfish, irresponsible, and harmful to people who depended on her. They were angry not just about the inconvenience her absence had created, but about her fundamental failure to fulfill the role they had assigned to her without her consent or input. Emma listened to the barrage of anger and hurt feelings for several minutes before finding her voice to respond. And when she finally spoke, her words came out steadier and clearer than she had expected. She told her family that she had never agreed to babysit Harper and Mason for the weekend, that no one had asked her whether she wanted to stay home or preferred to be included in the family vacation, that their assumptions about her availability were just that, assumptions rather than commitments she had made. The response to Emma's explanation was immediate and defensive, with Madison insisting that, of course, Emma would want to help family during their time of need, that it was selfish and unreasonable to expect advance notice or formal agreements about childcare within a family, that Emma's absence had forced them to choose between abandoning Harper and Mason or cutting short a vacation they desperately needed and could barely afford. Linda added her own layer of guilt and manipulation, expressing hurt that Emma would disappear without explanation, worry about Emma's safety and well-being, and confusion about why Emma was being so difficult and unreasonable about helping family members who were struggling through genuine crises. The implication was that Emma's behavior was not just inconvenient, but actually cruel, a betrayal of family values and basic human decency. Frank, as usual, remained mostly silent during the emotional confrontation, but his disappointed expression and occasional head shaking made it clear that he sided with his wife, an older daughter, in viewing Emma's actions as selfish and wrong. The family solidarity against her was complete and overwhelming, leaving Emma feeling isolated and attacked despite her growing conviction that she had done nothing actually wrong. The argument continued for over an hour, with Emma trying to explain her perspective and her family insisting that her explanations were just excuses for selfishness and irresponsibility. No one seemed interested in understanding why Emma had felt excluded from the family vacation or taken for granted as a childcare provider. No one acknowledged that their assumptions about her availability had been unfair or inconsiderate. No one apologized for planning around her presence without including her in the planning or asking for her input. Instead, the focus remained entirely on the inconvenience and upset that Emma's absence had created. The way her selfish choice had forced other people to sacrifice and struggle, the failure of communication and consideration that had characterized her departure. Emma found herself defending not just her specific actions, but her right to make choices about her own time and energy, her right to be included in family celebrations rather than automatically assigned to childcare duty, her right to pursue her own happiness rather than constantly subordinating her needs to everyone else's expectations. The most hurtful part of the entire confrontation was the realization that her family genuinely saw her as selfish and unreasonable for wanting to be treated as an equal family member rather than a convenient caretaker. They couldn't understand why she would prioritize a camping trip with friends over helping her sister with childcare responsibilities. They couldn't see why she would want to be invited to family celebrations rather than simply assigned to stay home and manage the practical details. They couldn't comprehend why she would choose her own happiness over their convenience, her own needs over their expectations. By the time the argument finally wound down into exhausted silence, Emma understood that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with her family. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had challenged expectations that couldn't be unchallenged, had asserted her own autonomy in a way that threatened the entire dynamic that had governed their family relationships for years. The aftermath of the confrontation was cold and tense, with Madison barely speaking to Emma except to make passive-aggressive comments about how difficult it is to find reliable help with childcare these days. Derek avoided Emma entirely, perhaps recognizing that his own dependence on her free labor had been part of the problem, but unwilling to acknowledge it directly. Linda and Frank tried to act as if nothing had happened, but every interaction was loaded with hurt feelings and unspoken resentment. Emma realized that she couldn't continue living in a situation where her own needs and desires were consistently treated as less important than everyone else's convenience and comfort. The weekend camping trip had reminded her of who she was beneath all the roles and responsibilities that had been piled on her. And she wasn't willing to give up that person again for the sake of family harmony that was built on her constant sacrifice and self-denial. The decision to move out felt both terrifying and inevitable, the next logical step in a process of self-assertion that had begun with her refusal to provide automatic childcare during her family's vacation. Emma knew that leaving would be seen as abandonment, that her family would view her choice as selfish and hurtful, that there would be guilt trips and emotional manipulation designed to make her change her mind. But she also knew that staying would mean accepting a role that diminished her personhood and subordinated her dreams to everyone else's immediate needs. Finding an apartment within her budget was challenging after months of contributing so much of her income to household expenses. But Emma managed to locate a small one-bedroom place on the outskirts of Indianapolis that was affordable and available immediately. It wasn't the spacious city apartment she had dreamed of during college, but it was hers, a space where she could make choices based on her own preferences rather than everyone else's needs and expectations. The conversation in which Emma announced her decision to move out was every bit as difficult and painful as she had anticipated, with tears and accusations and desperate attempts to guilt her into changing her mind. Haddison accused her of abandoning the family during their greatest time of need, while Linda expressed hurt and confusion about Emma's sudden selfishness and ingratitude. Frank remained mostly silent, but his disappointment was clear and devastating. Emma tried to explain that moving out wasn't about abandoning anyone, that it was about establishing healthy boundaries and building her own independent life, that she would still be part of the family even if she wasn't physically present to handle everyone's daily needs and emergencies. But her explanations fell on deaf ears, dismissed as rationalizations for selfishness and betrayal. The most hurtful accusation was that Emma was being ungrateful for everything her family had done for her, that she was repaying their love and support by walking away when they needed her most. Emma wanted to point out that she had been financially supporting the household for months, providing free childcare for her sister's children, and putting her own life on hold to help everyone else pursue their goals and recover from their crises. But she knew that defending herself would only escalate the conflict and that her family was determined to see her as the selfish villain in their narrative. Moving out was both liberating and heartbreaking, a necessary step toward independence that came at the cost of her relationship with the people she loved most in the world. Emma's family made it clear that they viewed her departure as a betrayal, that her choice to prioritize her own needs over their expectations had damaged something fundamental about their relationship that might never be repaired. But as Emma settled into her small apartment and began building a life that was truly her own, she also began to understand that some relationships require one person to constantly sacrifice, while others take and take and take. She began to see that her family's love had always been conditional on her willingness to subordinate herself to their needs, that their acceptance had depended on her constant availability and service. The guilt was intense and ongoing, but so was the relief of finally being free to make choices based on her own values and desires, rather than everyone else's expectations and emergencies. Emma started therapy to work through the complex emotions surrounding her decision and began rebuilding relationships with friends who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. Months later, as Emma planned her first real vacation in years and saved money for graduate school and pursued hobbies she had abandoned during her months of constant caretaking, she realized that standing up for herself had been the kindest thing she could have done for everyone involved. Her family had been forced to develop their own coping strategies and solutions, to take responsibility for their own choices and consequences, to grow in ways that her constant enabling had prevented. The relation she had learned for any family and choose Emma's if this it makes you human, worthy, and finally free.